Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this presentation on the Santa Fe River Watershed Stakeholder Assessment. This is our preliminary report showing our findings from our series of interviews and follow-up interviews with our stakeholders in the watershed. My name is Maury Hensley. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Watershed Association. So delighted to introduce to you also our research partners on this project, Todd Kaplan of Geosystems Analysis and Dr. Courtney Flint of Utah State University. Before we get started, I'd love to start with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that the land upon which this work was conducted, we want to name with gratitude and motivation that the Santa Fe River watershed is within the past, present, and future homelands of the Tewa and Kara-speaking Pueblos and the Apache nations. It is sacred to numerous other peoples, including the Tewa and Towa-speaking Pueblos, Dene, Ute, and Comanche nations. We are committed to working together with all of you to repair and heal our community, to understanding the past and present struggles and oppression of our Indigenous relatives, and to celebrating and supporting their fierce resilience, vision, and wisdom. I will now turn it over to Todd to give a little bit more background on how this project came about.
Okay, thank you, Maury. Hi, everybody. My name's Todd Kaplan, and I'm an ecologist. I've been practicing river restoration and watershed management in New Mexico in the Southwest for about 26 years. And I was, one of the projects that I worked on was the mitigation for the habitat mitigation for the Buckman Direct Diversion Project down in White Rock Canyon. And after working with the city of Santa Fe for a number of years, once that project ended, I visited with some of the program managers to find out, if they needed support with any other initiatives, especially knowing that they had embarked on a large and comprehensive water conservation program. The main thing that folks, especially program managers, were interested in was improving their communication and outreach to the broad stakeholder groups throughout the watershed. That's not my area of expertise, but I thought of Dr. Courtney Flint from Utah State University because I was at a conference on resilience in river ecosystems, and she was the keynote speaker talking about stakeholders, especially underserved communities in their relationship along rivers throughout the Western United States. So I contacted Dr. Flint. We connected with the Santa Fe Watershed Association and wrote this phase 1 grant. Really up to this point, all of the work done on the project that's involved stakeholder interviews has been conducted by Dr. Flint and her graduate student, Leonard Henderson. So I'll turn this over to Dr. Flint so she can explain what all she did and what she found.
Great. Thanks so much, Todd and Maury. It's been a real pleasure to work on this project and to meet some of the folks from Santa Fe and the watershed. Our original goal on this WaterSmart Cooperative Watershed Management Program was to kind of gather a lot of information about the watershed issues and the plans that were in place or being thought about, and to put a comprehensive list of stakeholders together for the watershed, which we did in cooperation with the Santa Fe Watershed Association and the city documents and city folks and others as well. And then the goal was to then move on to implementing some of our social science procedures so that we could document the priorities and concerns for a diverse set of stakeholders who affect and are affected by the watershed. And then our original third goal was to facilitate a deliberative workflow process with water managers in the area to think about these priorities and concerns along with the plans in the area and other sort of documents, and see where the directions the watershed could potentially go, and to culminate in really a plan for a plan, if you will. The phase 2 kind of grant process on these water smart things would be an actual water smart or watershed management plan. And so this is really leading some steps leading up to that. So today I want to just talk to you about this stakeholder assessment that we conducted to really assess the issues and concerns and priorities of a diverse set of stakeholders. So we'll dive right into that. So we use this map to really guide our process and to help us think about the watershed, you know, with the upper watershed up there in the high country, the middle watershed, including Santa Fe, but also broader parts of the county, the lower watershed, and some of the various communities there down through the Pueblo of Cochiti. And so thinking about the geography of the watershed was important to the process. We put together a diverse list of stakeholders from representing lots of different areas. 105 people and entities were invited to participate. We conducted a first phase of interviews with 63 people in 56 interviews, and these were really in depth, from 30 minutes to 2 hours long, and we really got into a lot of folks' issues and concerns. The phase 2 was what we called a Q-sort process, where we synthesized down from 193 priorities that were in the interviews down to a little bit more manageable set of 63 priorities for the river and the watershed. And 42 of the original 63 people from the interviews participated in this online sorting process related to the priorities. And we've been working on analysis and putting this report together in a preliminary way, because we really want to hear the feedback from folks in the watershed, which will inform our final reporting. And so we welcome your input on this. So when we first started out, we were really trying to make sure we were representative of sort of the broad categories of society. And so we were thinking about not only the government sort of decision makers from very local entities up through other city, county, state, federal, and Pueblo governments, but also what we call the civil society, that non-governmental realm, and thinking about both the environmental and non-environmental sides, and the business community, which we recognized related to this project. Some had quite a water-centric focus, and others were from business interests through that were far beyond water, like real estate and home building and so forth. So these were the stakeholders that we interviewed. This is the bottom part is a partial list, because due to various identification requests, we're not able to list everyone, but it gives you a good sense of the type of people we were working with. The figures at the top represent, each one represents an interview in each of these different sort of interest group areas. And so if we get right into some of the issues and concerns and priorities that we heard about, this is the first of 3 tables from the report, which is highlighting those topics that came up the most frequently. And so you can see all of the stick figures in each of these columns is all of the people in those interest groups, but the colored ones just refer to the people who mentioned this. These were things that were clearly top of mind in their interviews. And so you can see that many of the sort of consensus issues here related to water flow and in the river, and wildfire and forest management, which I think continues to be a concern. There was a lot of input on water quality and pollution, wanting a healthy ecosystem and habitat, and really thinking about efficient water use and conservation. Education and awareness was also mentioned a lot, and just concerns about climate change, amongst other things. And as you go down the list, you can see the various topics that emerged from our conversations. These were really rich, in-depth interviews with lots of quotes. I won't read through these now. They're in the report. You can take a look at them. But, some people had a full watershed perspective. Others were really just looking to the future and worried about whether there would be enough water for the people that live there and future generations. And then some people had very specific geographies to their focus. I think some people were really interested in the upper watershed, some in the lower watershed, etc. But there were also some real nuances and obstacles that came up through the interviews. Not everyone, even sharing common attention to these topics, not everyone felt the same way about how they should be handled. For example, thinking about wildfire and forest management, people varied in their perspectives on whether that should be a focus on a lot of thinning or not, which species should be targeted, concerns about smoke, etc. So different perspectives there. Different perspectives on acequias. Some acequias have adjudicated water rights, or litigated water rights, and others work on more of a good faith interactions with the water providers. You know, water quality varied, whether that people were thinking upper watershed or lower watershed, or even, you know, saying water quality was actually quite good. So lots of different perspectives there. Plenty of discussions about infrastructure, whether that's stormwater management in the city and the county and other aspects, but also the return flow pipeline was a topic of a lot of different perspectives in the interviews. You know, one of the biggest obstacles in preventing priorities from being met was funding. You know, it comes up everywhere, you know, just having enough resources to get the things done that need to be done, and to try to avoid too many problematic trade-offs. There were also a lot of assumptions of opposition, people assuming that people from a different interest group or, you know, kind of held the same perspectives and were really, you know, shutting things down and really making the conversation difficult. And so it's those assumptions that were really quite strong. And also some general barriers to participation, not everybody able to participate in the ongoing conversation related to water management. So this led us to another question, which was kind of, do you have a seat at the table? And so this graphic here represents how people kind of responded to that question, with some people indicating, yep, we're at the table, we're part of all these conversations. Some people, though, saying, you know, we're at the table for some things, but some things we're not, or we're kind of at the table, but we're only really to check a box to have our presence. Some people thought we're not at the table, we're not really part of the conversation, but we could be because we collaborate with others who are more at the center of things. And then others who really claimed that they just weren't at the table at all, despite feeling that they should be or wanted to be. And some of these quotes reflect some of the really key issues that came up. You know, this Pueblo quote says, one of the biggest obstacles that we see is collaboration between government, city government, state government, federal government, and tribal government for the same goal, a common reason to protect the watershed. And then someone from the city actually mentioned, you know, that when everybody's given a chance to talk about it, but there's no process by which that can be used to change the decision at any point or to influence the decision. So there were definitely some concerns about the process and the kind of dialogue and the ability to contribute to decision making for these watershed issues. So then it went on from the interviews to this sorting process that we ended up doing online. And this is really about extracting these interviews, these priorities from the interviews, and giving participants a chance to sort them from a high priority and on down into the lower priorities. All of the interview participants were invited to participate in this online Q-sort process. And we had 42 of those people who did participate. The Q-sort is really taking these priorities, and the analysis is grouping people rather than priorities. It's really looking at the different groups of people that share certain perspectives or viewpoints on the watershed. And so this graph here just shows our representation in the Q-sort process from the different interest groups, with those people who from the interviews that did not participate kind of grayed out there. This is the template that people use. They put their little statements in here to represent their highest to lowest priorities, from a high of 6 to a low of -6. It's important to note here that this doesn't represent a sort of a voting or a yes, no, up, down on priorities, just each priority being relative to another. And so we need to be careful in our interpretation. So this was the overall ranking of priorities. This is the top end of the table from the report. And you can see the kinds of things that were really, you know, commonly rated quite high. You know, this top thing, planning for climate change, was something that came up in the interviews, and the habitat issues, ecological issues, protecting native species, you know, really trying to work carefully on pollution issues, ecological justice and social equity. Of course, same as from the interviews, the fire issues became important, that flow in the river, again, pollution there, wildlife, and really thinking about stormwater management and permeable surfaces and water infiltration. These are things that ranked at least a 4 in that Q sort. On the other end, there are those things that just sort of sifted down to being a little bit lower priority. People just put other things a bit higher. And so you can see from this list that there are some things that are relatively lower. It doesn't mean that these things are not priorities. They were certainly stated as a priority from someone. But as people were sorting, these were the things that sort of drifted lower in their ranking in general. We did take these various statements and I kind of organized them in terms of themes to make them a little more manageable. And so comparing these things, these different statements, culture and technical solutions and the Pueblo interests, government processes were all things that were a little bit more higher priorities overall in general. And so this became sort of an organizing theme for how we looked at the groups that emerged. 5 groups emerged kind of quite clearly from the analysis. And so these 5 groups, which I'll walk through, the data kind of tells you which of the priorities are most held in common as high priorities. And that we took then to use that information to sort of name these groups, although different people might have different names. This was what we came up with. So the first group was this multi-use group focused on equity. There were representatives from across the environmental, city, and other governments, interest groups. And where this name came from is that this was a group that was focused on really diverse issues, and making the most use for the most people, thinking about climate change, but providing recreation, respecting cultural uses, thinking about forest thinning, acequias, water production, balancing water needs, having flow. So kind of this multi-use focus, and equity being really quite high, balancing the ecological justice and social equity. And as you look at the themes, they were highest on recreation, upper watershed, social equity, and those themes influenced our naming of this viewpoint group. Secondly, we had the urban technological management focus, again, cutting across interest groups. And this group really had a focus more on the urban areas, that stormwater management, sustainable development, efficiency programs throughout the city and watershed, and so forth. So this really was more of a technical and an urban focus here. And you can see that technical solution was their highest area of emphasis, with that upper watershed focus, the second highest. The ecocentric group, the third group, also cross-cutting across interest areas, and really emphasizing more of those ecological components, recognizing the rights of the river, the environmental needs need to be balanced with those needs of the city, maintaining restrictions, protecting species, etc. So wildlife corridors. So this was more of an ecological focus here. And on themes, you can see that they were really the lowest on that upper focus, culture, social equity, recreation, and a little bit more in the middle realms on some of these other thematic areas. The traditional cultural group, again, cutting across groups, not just coming out of the more traditional focused interest groups, but cutting across these other interests. And this is where you have the highest score for respecting traditional cultural uses and spaces of river and watershed. The rights of Pueblos is right up in there, recognizing acequia rights, and as well as native species and so forth. So you can see that the cultural aspects, the Pueblos, and the government process improvements were some of the highest areas, as well as education for this group. The lower watershed collaborative management focused group was an interesting case, because we had one person who, what we say, loaded into this group. They fit into this group, but only because they were in direct opposition to how other people sorted the priorities. And that was they had more in common with the opposite of those priorities than they did with any of the other groups. So that became a bit of a unique situation in our analysis. But this group was really emphasizing stopping that return flow pipeline, and really talking about the lower watershed users and concerns about the habitats below the wastewater treatment plant, native species, and so forth. And so those are the 5 groups. This one had the highest on the lower focus, and they also had high on the social equity area as well, but not particularly high on the Pueblo interest. So that distinguished this group from that traditional cultural management focus. So when you put all of these things back together with the different groups, you can see here how the groups related to each other, and the color coding starts to get a little bit more mixed as you come down through here. And this is how we understood that different groups of people have different viewpoints on the priorities of the watershed. And so you can see this on the lower end as well, that even though things are generally lower, some of the groups continue to be quite high in certain areas. So we want to acknowledge some of the limitations of this work. When you're working with a finite set of people, you're always concerned about how representative they are of everyone in the watershed. We worked real closely and concertedly to make sure we had good representation across different interest groups. But of course, we could have had larger participation, as is the case with a lot of these kinds of assessments. We weren't able to do this work face-to-face because of the pandemic, and that limited some of our interactions, and should be acknowledged. And time really passes, and we are fully aware that issues can emerge and evolve and can sort of change the priorities. So we want to note that these data were collected, and the interviews were in 2021, and the sorting process was really in 2022, and this will be a marker for that time frame, but things can evolve. As we think about these interest groups that we started with, there's a lot of previous work that would suggest that these different interest groups can be quite separate and siloed, or they can come together around shared interests and kind of create this generalized action for the good of the whole. And that we call this interactional capacity, when these people from different vantage points and interest groups come together and see their common goals and work together. But it's complicated because each different person and each different viewpoint group has these different vantage points on the watershed, focused on different parts of the geography, different issues. And we've got all these external connections that are coming in and complicating things. And so it becomes a real question mark. In this project, we really found that these sector groups that in these color-coded lines, along the bottom, turned out to not be very monolithic, that despite those assumptions of opposition by different groups, in fact, the viewpoints really merged different interest group perspectives. So the different groups that came out of the sorting process are around this circle here, that multi-use group, urban group, lower watershed, traditional cultural, ecocentric. And so we're seeing that we have different viewpoints held by different people in the watershed. And the real question is, will these groups find some good shared goals that they can then generalize their collective action around to move the watershed forward? And a watershed management plan might help to galvanize support for some of these shared goals. But doing this takes some effort. It's challenging. You have to really have a catalyst for collaborating and trying to work together. You have to dedicate the time to really listening, spending time, learning these perspectives from other people. Building trust is really a common denominator across so many of these efforts. Lots can be built upon trust, but the lack of trust can really deteriorate this kind of interaction. Having those shared goals and integrating knowledge from different perspectives, vantage points, viewpoints, those things all go into what we call interactional capacity, that ability to work together to address shared goals. And by doing so, you can help to increase the resilience for a wider group of people on a wider array of environmental issues. So just to sum up, we heard lots of different issues, concerns, and priorities from the folks we spoke to. There were some general consensus around some key issues like flow and water in the river, water quality, climate change, habitat, that fire and forest management component. Of course, the devil's in the details on how those things should be addressed, but there's definitely some shared goals here emerging. The challenge is finding agreement on a plan of action, how the process unfolds really matters to people in the Santa Fe watershed, and there may be room for embellishing and really developing those processes to be a little more inclusive. And these interest groups that we went in with and often think of as being sort of monolithic have a lot of internal diversity. And so we've got to open our minds to thinking about that. Our next steps, we did just meet with stakeholder groups for feedback. We welcome your feedback if you're watching this online. We will be identifying some key findings and recommendations, and we'll have our final report to the Watershed Association and others in the watershed by March. And so I thank you for your time and interest, and have a great day.